Okay, so this is an introduction to Chapter 35, which looks at the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. If you remember back from earlier in the year, we touched on this when we looked at Principle 10, which was, of course, part of Mankiw's 10 Principles of Economics. All right, so we start this chapter off basically looking at a concept known as the Phillips Curve. And the Phillips Curve was created in part, actually mostly, by a guy by the name of A.W. Phillips, who studied the relationship between unemployment and inflation, as well as wages, over the course of the better part of his life, and he did this in the United Kingdom. So what the Phillips Curve does, and you can kind of see it from the reflection of these dots here on the curve, but the Phillips Curve basically shows an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. And for the most part, when we look at this shouldn't be too much of a surprise, because we've seen already that when we look at the concept of economic growth or contractions in the economy, that there is a great correlation, of course, between the notion of growth and low unemployment, and then the notion of contraction and then high unemployment. So Phillips put this into the form of a curve. Okay, so you can see that here. Again, represented. Now, what do you need to know for the AP exam? Because that's really the most important part of this concept of the Phillips curve. And what you need to know is that basically there are a couple different ways of looking at the Phillips curve. First of all, the Phillips curve has what's called the short-run Phillips curve. And the short-run Phillips curve shows us in a very basic way this concept of short-run relationship between inflation and unemployment. So let's take a look at what is on each of the axes first, and that'll be to start us off with understanding this model. Okay, so on the y-axis, or the vertical axis, is the inflation rate, okay, and that's obviously interpreted as a percentage. On the x-axis is the unemployment rate. And so what we know from this model, or we know from this concept, this principle, is that when we have inflation, okay, at a high level, let's say 6%, that unemployment will be very low, let's say at 2%. And again, we have this concept, this notion of an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. So it creates a downward sloping curve, as you can see on the graph in front of you. And so again, one more time, that when the inflation rate is high, that is when prices are high, we can expect unemployment to be low. So let's say that inflation drops to 1%. Okay, what's going to be the net effect of this? Well, if the economy is growing very slow, and we see that prices are also not growing very fast either, well, that there is going to be a correlation. That when inflation is low, unemployment will be high. Let's say at, 8%. So this is the concept of the Phillips curve. Now, we can actually combine. We can look at both of these, or this model, as well as the model that we just recently studied. And we're going to look at these side by side to get a better understanding of how the Phillips curve is related to this concept of aggregate supply and demand that we just studied. So we're going to look at a very basic Phillips curve and a basic aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Let's first set up our graphs, okay, or set up our axes. Remember that with aggregate supply and aggregate demand, price levels are here on the y, and real GDP, that is the quantity of what the economy can produce, is on the x. Let's set up our Phillips curve. Again, inflation rate is a percentage, unemployment rate is a percentage on both of the axes here. Okay, so we're going to start off with equilibrium in a basic aggregate supply and demand model. So we're not even going to put long run in here just yet. We're just going to keep it basic, keep it real simple. Short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And we're going to say that at a price level of 103, which would basically mean that there was 3% increases in CPI or GDP deflator, that we have a quantity of output in the economy in terms of GDP of 14.5 trillion. Now let's connect that to the Phillips curve. So we're going to say on the short-run Phillips curve, we've got 3%, same thing, 3% inflation, 3% increase in price level. And at this point, okay, instead of identifying the fact that we had 14.5 trillion GDP, we're going to say that, this is going to represent the unemployment rate. So over here we have now, let's say, 5% unemployment. So we've connected this at a standard growth model of 3% in the economy, about 14.5 trillion GDP, and 5% unemployment, which would be pretty much a normal rate of unemployment. Now let's say that something happens in the economy that changes this scenario, right? So this is like our basic setup of economic standards, economic growth, consistent economic growth. But let's say that we have a shift to the right of our aggregate demand curve. So in essence now we've had something that's happened that's caused this, concept of economic growth to increase. Our car is starting to drive a little faster, if you will, in our economy. So AD is shifting to the right, as you can see here. You can go ahead and set that up on your graph too. Well, what is going to be the result of a shift to the right in aggregate demand? Well, you guys already know this. A shift to the right in aggregate demand is going to bring prices up. Let's say it just brings it up to 106 on the CPI or GDP inflator, or another 3%. Okay, so what is going to happen to GDP as a result of the increased aggregate demand? Well, it's going to increase output. It's going to bring us to that bullet point B. Let's say it doesn't matter, but let's just say 16 trillion. Okay, so now we have this increase in aggregate demand. How do we connect this to the short-run Phillips curve? Okay, well, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to say, okay, prices went up. Let's say, 6% or 3% from where it was. And so what's that going to do to the Phillips curve? Well, it's going to actually create movement along the Phillips curve. You can see it right here. Okay? And it's going to bring us to point B. And so with this increase in inflation, this increase in growth is really what happened that caused prices to go up. This is going to cause the unemployment rate to come down, okay, to about, let's say, 2%. Now, if we had the long run in here, you could see that this would be an inflationary gap or some kind of a bubble maybe that was created. But we're just connecting the basic here, the basic Phillips curve. All right, let's take it the other way around. Let's say that aggregate demand shifts to the left, okay? So we see a decrease in aggregate demand. Well, you know from studying aggregate supply and demand that whenever aggregate demand shifts to the left, that is reflective of people, consumers, firms, government, foreigners buying less of our stuff or buying less of U.S. produced economic products. So if we have this shift to the left, that means that we're having a contraction in the economy, or at least a slowdown to the very least. So, all right, so we're going to go to 82 now, and what that's going to do is it's going to bring our prices down. Let's just say to 101 on the index. It's going to bring us to bullet point C, which you can see there on the graph. And that effectively is going to slow down our economy. We're going to produce less stuff. And so ultimately, let's say it just brings us to a 13 trillion output, okay? All right, well, let's look at how that would be affected over here on the Phillips curve. All right, so again, we've got the decrease in the inflation rate and decrease in prices, okay, same thing, down to 1% of, from the whatever we're looking at here on this model. And so as the economy slows down, right, that's going to also have an effect on unemployment. We've actually talked about this before, but we didn't actually qualify it on a graph. So here, that's what we're doing. Okay, so this is going to bring us to bullet point C. And so what's going to happen to the unemployment rate now is the unemployment rate is actually going to increase, let's say to 8%. So what's happened? Well, we've made the correlation, the connection, if you will, between aggregate supply and aggregate demand and the Phillips curve. When the economy is growing, aggregate demand is shifting to the right, prices are going to go up. Output's going to go up. Well, over here on our Phillips curve, the unemployment rate is going to be affected by these increases in prices too, or this increase in growth. So as the economy increases in growth, prices come up. Okay, that brings, of course, the inflation rate up, and we see the movement along the Phillips curve as unemployment rate falls. And then vice versa for aggregate demand shifting to the left. So when economists first saw this, and you look at, if you in your book, I think it mentions this, that they thought this was basically a way for them to manipulate the economy at any given time. That they could essentially control the unemployment rate through controlling price levels. But it turns out that the Phillips curve is also kind of like long-run aggregate supply in that the model, in that it also has a long-run Phillips curve, right? An inelastic Phillips curve. So here's the thing. Even though in the short run there is this connection, there is this correlation between high prices, low unemployment, or low prices, high unemployment, in the long run, the Phillips curve is actually inelastic. So we have this long run Phillips curve, you can see, perfectly vertical, just like our long run aggregate supply. And so what is this a reflection of? Well, this is basically a reflection of, our economy constantly coming into full correction in the long run. And so in other words, in the long run, unemployment is not responsive to prices because of rational expectations. People understand that the prices are going to go up, that prices go up means that their wages should go up. And of course, that creates that correction in the economy, which brings us back to long run, if you will. Okay, so what does the long run Phillips curve show us? Well, it just shows us basically that employment is not responsive to inflation in the long run. All right, so let's look at it how that would work on this on the long run. So, all right, 6% inflation drops to 1%. In the long run, we just go right back to full employment, okay, at maybe 5% or 6%, right? So this Phillips curve, the long run Phillips curve, shows our economy where it is at full employment, just like it did with the long run aggregate supply model, okay? So we've got this long run Phillips curve in there, and so we kind of understand what this is because we had this discussion already with respect to the LRAS and SRAS and all of that. But just know that based on what we've already learned, we'll always end up in the long run, back in the long run, if you will, okay? And so my last point here on the PowerPoint is that short run adjustments to wages, when we get back to long run, have been made, bringing the economy back to long run. In effect, what I just mentioned, that people will eventually adjust to prices going up or prices going down. If prices are going up rapidly, they'll want more money. If prices are going down, eventually they'll accept lower money, lower wages. Okay, so we'll always end up back at the long run. We can't always consistently exist in inflationary conditions or contractionary conditions. Okay, let's combine these two because that's going to represent the concept of the Phillips curve in its full essence. All right, so when we combine the long run and the short run, basically we have this, okay? We've got our short run Phillips curve. We've got our long run Phillips curve. We've got a point of equilibrium where they intersect. Let's just say 3% normal economic growth as we've indicated before in our class. So that's going to be at bullet point A, okay? 5 to 6% unemployment, the natural rate of unemployment. So if prices go up, inflation occurs. In the short run, we'll have that movement along the curve, okay? We'll go from point A to point B, and what that really is a reflection of is that we're having a lowering in the rate of unemployment, okay? So from 3 to 6% brings our unemployment rate down to 2%, and that basically moves us along this Phillips curve, okay? And once again, when we have short run, when we have inflation fall or deflation, disinflation, whatever you want to call it, this is also going to have an effect on the short run Phillips curve. Movement along the curve, bringing unemployment up, back, let's say to 8%. Okay, so here's what the long run Phillips curve model looks like when we connect short run with it.